The sound of Detroit once filled the air with promise. Inside a small studio on West Grand Boulevard, a young woman sat by a piano, shaping melodies that would change the course of Motown forever. She wasn't on stage. She wasn't in front of the camera. But without her, one of music's brightest stars might have been silenced before his time. What happens when the voice that saves another's career never gets heard loud enough for her own? This is the story of Sylvia Moy, the woman who gave Motown its voice, yet remained in the shadows of its spotlight. Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, maybe a cup of water or tea, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Long before the gold records and flashing cameras, there was a little girl on the northeast side of Detroit who couldn't stop hearing music in her head. Her name was Sylvia Moy, born on the 15th of September 1938, in a city already pulsing with rhythm. The sound of jazz drifted through open windows, and every corner store radio played something that made the world feel alive. Detroit wasn't glamorous, then it was hard-working, loud, and full of people chasing a dream, and Sylvia was one of them. She grew up in a modest home surrounded by family and faith. Her parents couldn't offer her riches, but they gave her something far more powerful: encouragement. They told her that her voice mattered, that her music had meaning. From the moment her fingers touched a piano key, she knew that this was how she would speak to the world. While most girls her age were taught to be quiet, Sylvia learned how to make the room listen. At Northern High School, she studied classical music and jazz, mastering not just melody but discipline. She could play Bach one moment and improvise a blues line the next. That duality, grace, and grit would become her signature. Teachers often said she had something that couldn't be taught, a way of feeling music rather than simply reading it. It was as if she carried Detroit's heartbeat inside her. By the early 1960 period, Sylvia began performing in local clubs. The rooms were smoky, crowded, alive with sound. Sometimes she sang, sometimes she played piano, but every time she performed, people stopped talking. Her music wasn't loud or showy, it was honest. That honesty is what caught the attention of two men who happened to be there one night, Marvin Gaye and Mickey Stevenson. They saw something rare, a woman who not only sang beautifully but understood the architecture of music itself. In 1963, they introduced her to the place that would change her life, Motown. Walking through the doors of Hitsville, USA for the first time, Sylvia felt a mix of awe and belonging. The walls were lined with echoes of dreams, young artists chasing a sound that would soon conquer the world. Berry Gordy, the man behind Motown, listened to her and saw potential. She was signed not just as a singer, but as a songwriter and artist, a creative mind who could help build the sound of the label's next chapter. But Motown, even at its height, wasn't an easy place for a woman. The studio was filled with strong voices, most of them male, and the unspoken rule was clear. Women sang the songs, men wrote them. Sylvia didn't accept that. When the company told her they needed songwriters more than singers, she didn't protest. She simply said, "Then I'll write something worth remembering." That quiet determination would define her life. At night, she'd sit by the upright piano in the studio, tapping rhythm on her notebook, searching for words that could carry the feeling of the streets outside. The hum of Detroit's factories, the laughter of children, the ache of growing up, she put it all into melody. It wasn't just about writing a hit. It was about capturing the truth of her world. Friends recalled that she had a way of describing songs like people. "Each one has a soul," she'd say. "You just have to listen long enough to hear it." That belief made her different. She wasn't chasing fame, she was chasing connection. By the time she turned 25, Motown was exploding with success. Stevie Wonder, the Supremes, the Temptations, the label was changing the sound of America. But in the midst of all that noise, Sylvia Moy was quietly preparing to make her mark. Her story was only beginning, and soon, she would help save the career of one of the world's greatest artists. Before the red carpets and the awards, before her name was written in liner notes that few would ever read, there was just a dream, a piano, and a young woman brave enough to believe that her songs could change everything. When Sylvia Moy first walked through the doors of Hitsville, USA in 1963, she wasn't entering a music label, she was stepping into a dream factory. From the outside, it was just a small white house on West Grand Boulevard, but inside, it felt like the center of the universe. Laughter, piano chords, and the steady thump of a bass line spilled out of every room. Someone was always writing, someone was always recording, and everyone was chasing that next hit that might change their life. For a young woman from the northeast side of Detroit, it was overwhelming and thrilling. Sylvia had come to Motown as a singer, but the moment she met Berry Gordy, the man behind the empire, her path changed. Gordy listened to her demo and said gently, "We already have plenty of singers. What we need are writers." To many, that might have sounded like rejection. To Sylvia, it sounded like destiny. She didn't see herself being turned away from the microphone. She saw an invitation to speak in a new language. Writing, for her, wasn't a backup plan. It was a calling. She began showing up early, staying late, watching how the greats worked: Smokey Robinson polishing lyrics, Holland Dozier, Holland arguing over hooks, Marvin Gaye refining melodies until they shimmered. Sylvia took it all in, learning how Motown's assembly line of hits wasn't just business, it was art built on discipline and feeling. But the road wasn't easy. The songwriting rooms were crowded with men who weren't used to seeing a woman at the table. When she offered an idea, some smiled politely, others ignored her entirely. She never raised her voice or demanded attention. She simply wrote something better. Her notebooks filled with sketches of lyrics, stray melodies, half-finished poems. And little by little, her songs began to speak for her. At night, when the building grew quiet, Sylvia would sit by the upright piano in Studio A. She'd tap her pen against the keys, humming softly, trying to capture the heartbeat of the city outside, the hum of factories, the chatter of children, the hope and struggle of everyday life. Detroit had a rhythm all its own, and she wanted the world to hear it. Her early compositions showed an unusual sensitivity, soulful but structured, emotional but never sentimental. She believed every song had a story, and every story had a soul. "You just have to listen long enough," she'd say, "and it will tell you what it wants to be." By the mid-1960 period, Sylvia was no longer the quiet new girl in the corner. People were starting to notice. Producers came to her for lyrics. Musicians asked her to help fix a chorus that didn't land. The men who once overlooked her began seeking her advice. Without ever raising her voice, Sylvia had earned her place not through power, but through presence. She had entered Motown as a singer. She was becoming something greater, a storyteller, a bridge between sound and emotion. And soon, that gift would be tested in a way that would define her legacy forever. By the mid-1960 period, Motown was booming. Stevie Wonder had become the label's young prodigy, the little Stevie, whose harmonica and smile had won over the world. But fame can be fragile, and in the music industry, it often is. As Stevie grew older, his voice began to change. The boyish tone that once made audiences melt was fading. Record sales slipped, and so did the confidence of those around him. Behind closed doors, the executives whispered about ending his contract. Berry Gordy had built Motown on momentum. If something wasn't working, he moved on. It wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But to Sylvia Moy, the thought of letting Stevie go felt wrong. She saw what others didn't, a spark that hadn't dimmed, just shifted. So one afternoon, she walked into Gordy's office and made a promise that would change both their lives. "If I can write him a hit," she said, "will you keep him?" Gordy studied her for a moment, a young woman daring to make such a bold offer in a room full of powerful men. Then he nodded. "You've got one shot," he told her. Sylvia left that office with a mission. She went straight to the studio, joined by producer Hank Cosby, and together they began working on something new. The song needed to sound like youth, but with maturity. It needed rhythm, joy, and grit, something that would make the world dance again. For hours they experimented, piecing together words and notes. Sylvia's pencil tapped against her lyric pad as she murmured the line that would anchor it all. "Baby, everything's all right, uptight, out of sight." It wasn't polished poetry, it was pure feeling. The phrase captured exactly what she wanted to say: confidence born from struggle, celebration born from faith. When Stevie stepped up to the microphone to record "Uptight, Everything's All Right," something magical happened. His voice cracked in places, stronger in others, not the same boyish tone the public once knew, but something richer, braver. Sylvia sat behind the glass, mouthing every line as if she were singing it herself. By the time the last note faded, everyone in the studio knew they had a hit. When the song hit the radio, it exploded. The beat was infectious, the energy unstoppable. Within weeks, Uptight, Everything's All Right, shot up the charts, reviving Stevie Wonder's career and proving that his evolution wasn't the end, it was a new beginning. For Sylvia, it was a quiet triumph. Her name appeared in small print on the record sleeve songwriter, co-writer, producer, but her satisfaction wasn't in credit. It was in hearing that sound blasting from car radios across Detroit, knowing she had kept a young artist's dream alive. And the magic didn't stop there. Together with Hank Cosby and Stevie, she co-wrote some of his greatest works. My Cherie Amour, I Was Made to Love Her, Never Had a Dream Come True. Each song carried her warmth, her understanding of what it meant to feel both joy and longing. She didn't just write for Stevie, she wrote with him, capturing emotions words alone couldn't hold. Years later, when asked about that moment, Stevie Wonder said, "Sylvia Moy saved my career," but she never repeated the phrase. She'd only smile and say, "He always had it in him, I just helped him find it again." It was humility, not modesty. She understood something most people in the industry forgot, that true power doesn't come from standing in the spotlight. It comes from knowing how to lift someone else into it. By the time the world caught up to her work, Sylvia Moy had already become one of Motown's secret weapons. The success of Uptight, Everything's All Right, opened doors that had long been closed to women in the label's writing rooms. Inside the small, bustling house on West Grand Boulevard, people began to recognize that the woman with the quiet voice and the spiral notebook wasn't just good, she was extraordinary. The following years were a whirlwind of creativity. Sylvia and her partners, Hank Cosby and Stevie Wonder, formed a trio that could do no wrong. Their chemistry was effortless. Hank shaped the sound, Stevie breathed life into it, and Sylvia gave it meaning. Together, they created songs that didn't just climb charts. They told stories about love, youth, and survival. When My Cherie Amour began to take shape, Sylvia spent nights polishing its melody, wanting every word to feel like a sigh, every note like a heartbeat. It wasn't just a song about love, it was a portrait of innocence, written by someone who had seen the cost of chasing dreams. Stevie's tender voice carried it perfectly, and the song became one of Motown's most timeless ballads. Then came I Was Made to Love Her, raw, joyful, bursting with rhythm. Sylvia infused the lyrics with playfulness, almost like a conversation between two people who already knew they were meant for each other. When it hit the radio, it sounded like sunshine. The song captured everything. Motown stood for energy, hope, and heart. Inside Studio A, the air was thick with the smell of tape reels and coffee. Sylvia often worked in the background, perched at the edge of the piano bench, scribbling lines as musicians rehearsed. Sometimes she'd stop and close her eyes, listening not just to the music but to what it wanted to become. Those who worked with her said she had a way of pulling emotion out of thin air. She could turn an idea into a feeling, and a feeling into a hit. Her pen didn't stop with Stevie. She wrote for Martha and the Vandellas, Love Bug Leave My Heart Alone, and for the Isley Brothers with This Old Heart of Mine Is Weak for You. Each song carried a trace of her identity, soulful, melodic, and sincere. Even when others sang her words, you could feel her fingerprints on every phrase. By the mid-1960 period, Sylvia Moy was shaping the very sound of an era. But fame wasn't what she chased. She once said, "I never wanted to be seen, I wanted to be heard." In a world obsessed with spotlights, she found peace in the shadows. The music spoke loud enough for her. When she walked through the halls of Hitsville, younger writers stopped to greet her. Engineers nodded respectfully. Musicians sought her advice. She had become what few women in that industry ever could, a quiet force, commanding through kindness and craft. At her creative peak, Sylvia Moy wasn't just writing songs, she was defining the language of Motown itself. And yet, even as her melodies conquered radio waves, another truth lingered beneath the surface. The world was dancing to her music, but most people still didn't know her name. At the height of her success, Sylvia Moy had become indispensable to Motown, yet invisible to much of the world. Her songs filled jukeboxes, wedding halls, and radio waves, but the name behind those melodies rarely left the label's liner notes. She was the heartbeat of Motown's sound, and yet her face remained unknown. It wasn't that people meant to forget her. The machine of fame simply didn't have space for those who stood behind the microphone instead of in front of it. When Stevie Wonder took the stage to sing My Chérie Amour, crowds cheered, cameras flashed, and awards followed. Somewhere backstage, Sylvia would watch with pride but also a quiet ache. She was proud of him, but part of her knew that in the world's eyes, her contribution would always be invisible. Motown in the late 1960 period was changing fast. The music industry was growing louder, glossier, and more competitive. Los Angeles was calling promising bigger studios, movie tie-ins, and global reach. The Motown sound was evolving, but it was also moving away from the soul of Detroit, from the very heartbeat that Sylvia had poured into her writing. When the label decided to move operations west, Sylvia faced a choice: follow the crowd or stay loyal to the city that raised her. She chose Detroit. For her, Detroit wasn't just home, it was muse. It was the sound of engines in the distance, of neighbors laughing on the porch, of children playing in the streets after church on Sunday. She believed that if she left, the music would lose something honest. So while Motown packed its boxes and boarded flights to California, Sylvia stayed behind, writing in a quiet studio that suddenly felt too empty. Those who knew her said she never complained. She still smiled, still encouraged younger artists, still hummed new melodies under her breath. But something had shifted. Without the constant hum of the Motown family around her, the nights felt longer, the silence heavier. The phone didn't ring as often. Projects slowed. She was still brilliant, but in an industry that moved faster every year, brilliance alone wasn't enough. And yet, Sylvia never stopped creating. Even in those quieter moments, she continued to write songs for others, songs for herself, songs that might never see the light of day. When asked once if she felt forgotten, she answered softly, "No one's ever forgotten who they are when they're doing what they love." It was the kind of truth that defined her. She measured success not by fame, but by the ability to keep believing in her gift. While others chased awards, she chased sincerity. While others moved to California, she stayed grounded in Detroit, where the echoes of her greatest work still lingered in every streetlight. The irony was almost poetic. At the very moment when the world was dancing to her music, she was learning what it meant to disappear from its spotlight. It wasn't tragedy in the dramatic sense. It was the quieter kind, the slow fading of recognition, the loneliness that follows achievement. But Sylvia Moy had never needed applause to know her worth. Her legacy was already written in every song that made people fall in love, in every lyric that made them believe again. The world just didn't know it yet. When the lights of Motown dimmed in Detroit, Sylvia Moy didn't chase them west. She stayed loyal to the city that had shaped her rhythm and soul. The once bustling halls of Hitsville had gone quiet, the laughter replaced by echoes. For many, the dream had moved to Los Angeles. But for Sylvia, Detroit was still alive. She could hear its pulse in the factories, in the church choirs, in the children who still hummed songs she had written years before. The shift wasn't easy. The phone calls came less often. The sessions she once led were now assigned to younger writers with new sounds. Record executives stopped by her studio less frequently, but Sylvia kept working anyway. She always believed music was a gift, and gifts weren't meant to be abandoned just because the world stopped applauding. In the early 1970 period, she began to reinvent herself quietly. Hollywood was calling for television music, and Sylvia answered. She wrote theme songs for shows like Blossom and Growing Pains, warm, familiar melodies that carried her sense of optimism. The songs weren't chart toppers, but they reached homes across America every week, reminding people, even if they didn't know her name, that she was still there, still creating beauty. Her days were simple but filled with purpose. Mornings were for writing, afternoons for mentoring young musicians who came by her small studio, evenings for reflection. She never lost her warmth. To those who met her, she was still the same soft-spoken, radiant, full of quiet wisdom. She didn't dwell on what was lost. She focused on what could still be built. But in the stillness of those years, there was loneliness too. Fame had never been her goal, but being forgotten carried its own kind of ache. Sometimes she'd sit by the piano, play a few bars from My Chérie Amour, and smile faintly at the memory of a younger version of herself, the woman who once stood in the heart of Motown, surrounded by laughter and possibility. Now, the room was silent, and the applause existed only in memory. Friends recalled visiting her home in Detroit during that period. Her walls were lined with gold records, yet dust had gathered on the frames. She rarely talked about them. That was another lifetime, she'd say. To her, success was something you carried quietly, not a trophy to display, but a truth to live by. Still, she found a new kind of fulfillment. Her greatest work in those years wasn't a song, it was a gift she gave to others. She founded the Center for Creative Communications, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping underprivileged children in Detroit find their voice through art and music. For Sylvia, this was her encore not under stage lights, but under classroom fluorescence, showing kids that creativity could be a form of survival. The city around her changed. Detroit's golden age faded, but Sylvia remained, steady as ever. To her, music wasn't about trends or fame, it was about memory. And even in her quiet years, she was still writing them one melody, one student, one small act of kindness at a time. As the years slipped quietly forward, Sylvia Moy's world became smaller, not in spirit, but in reach. The spotlight that once flickered just behind her had moved elsewhere. Detroit's music scene had changed. Motown was now a memory. But for Sylvia, memory was sacred. She lived among it every day, surrounded by the faint hum of her own legacy. The industry had long since shifted to younger voices, new trends, new sounds. The songs she wrote decades earlier still played on radios, but her name was rarely mentioned. To some, she was just another credit on a record sleeve. Yet to those who truly knew, she was the foundation, the woman who had built melodies that would never age. There were moments of sadness, of course. The phone that once rang with opportunity now sat silent most days, but Sylvia never complained. She used to say that music had already given her everything she needed, a life, a purpose, a reason to keep believing. What more could she ask for? Her days grew gentler. Teaching became her rhythm, helping children who reminded her of herself full of hope, but unsure where to place it. She often told them, "You don't have to be seen to make a difference. You just have to make something that lasts." And in that small Detroit classroom, where laughter replaced applause, Sylvia found her peace. Still, time is a patient thief. The long nights in the studio had taken their toll. By the early 2000 period, her health began to falter. Friends noticed she moved slower, spoke softer, but even then, she refused to stop teaching. "Music keeps me alive," she'd say with a smile, "and as long as I'm alive, I'll keep giving it back." In 2006, the world briefly remembered. Sylvia Moy was inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame, alongside her longtime collaborator Hank Cosby. It was a rare moment of recognition for a lifetime of unseen work. As she stood on stage that night, accepting the honor, she thanked not the industry, but the music itself. "It never left me," she said. The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was honest, and it was hers. After that, the years passed quietly. Detroit grew colder in winter, and her health continued to fade. Yet she stayed where she had always belonged, near the piano, near her city, near the heart of her story. On the 15th of April, 2017, Sylvia Moy passed away from complications of pneumonia. She was 78. When news of her death broke, tributes poured in from musicians, songwriters, and fans who had grown up with her music. Some admitted they had never known her name until that moment, but her songs had lived in their lives for decades. It was fitting, in a way. Sylvia had always believed the song mattered more than the singer. Even in death, that belief held true. The world might have forgotten her face, but her melodies, the ones that carried joy, love, and hope, would never fade. Long after the last Motown session faded into history, Sylvia Moy's songs continued to live, not as relics of another era, but as timeless echoes of what it meant to feel something real. You could walk into a cafe, a wedding, or a passing taxi, and somewhere in the background, a familiar melody would begin. Uptight, everything's all right. My chérie amour, I was made to love her. The world didn't always remember who wrote them, but the heart never forgot how they felt. Her music carried a special kind of honesty. Unlike many of her peers, Sylvia didn't write from fantasy, she wrote from experience, from the rhythm of Detroit's streets, from the joy and pain she saw around her. Every lyric she touched had a pulse. Even when her name was hidden in small print, her presence was unmistakable. You could hear her in the optimism of the melodies, the sincerity of the words, and the balance of soul and sophistication that defined the Motown sound. Artists who came after her often spoke of that balance. Alicia Keys once described Motown's legacy as music that feels like home. That was Sylvia's gift. She made songs that felt lived in, familiar, warm. She understood how to blend emotion with precision, how to make a lyric sound both personal and universal. Her work stood at the intersection of jazz, soul, and pop, a meeting point that helped shape what would later become modern R&B. When you study her songwriting, you realize her genius wasn't loud, it was disciplined. Her use of phrasing, the rise and fall of her verses, the subtle way her words lifted Stevie Wonder's voice, all of it came from a deep understanding of both craft and heart. She once said, "A song is like a conversation. If you listen long enough, it'll tell you how to write it." That philosophy guided everything she did. Her collaborations became landmarks. With Hank Cosby and Stevie Wonder, she built a body of work that still defines an era. With Martha and the Vandellas, she gave rhythm a voice of freedom. With the Isley Brothers, she captured longing and vulnerability in ways few could. Every partnership was different, but all shared the same foundation: trust. People trusted Sylvia because she wrote without ego. She wrote to elevate others. Even as music evolved from vinyl to digital, from soul to hip-hop, her influence never disappeared. You can hear her spirit in every artist who blends authenticity with melody, who writes from truth instead of image. The women who came after, from Lauryn Hill to Her, walked through doors Sylvia helped open long before they existed. She proved that a woman could be the architect of sound, not just its interpreter. And in a world that so often forgets its architects, Sylvia Moy's songs remain the proof. They are living evidence that melody can outlast memory and truth can outshine fame. Long after her passing, every time My Chérie Amour plays on the radio, her legacy sings again, quietly, beautifully, exactly as she would have wanted. When Sylvia Moy passed away on the 15th of April 2017, the news traveled quietly like the final note of a song that fades before you realize its ending. For some, it was a surprise, a reminder that the woman who had written the soundtrack of their youth had been there all along. For others, musicians, historians, and those who had worked beside her, it was a moment of reflection, a call to finally say her name out loud. Tributes came from across America. Stevie Wonder, heartbroken but proud, called her "the reason I'm still here." For him, she wasn't just a songwriter, she was the bridge between his past and his future. Others described her as a pioneer, a woman who quietly broke the rules without ever asking for permission. Radio stations replayed her songs, newspapers revisited her story, and fans flooded comment sections with messages of gratitude. "I didn't know her name," one wrote, "but her songs carried me through my hardest days." That was the essence of Sylvia Moy, the invisible hand that had touched millions without demanding to be seen. In death, the world finally began to recognize what it had overlooked in life. Articles appeared calling her Motown's hidden genius and the woman who saved Stevie Wonder. For younger generations discovering her work, it was almost shocking that someone so integral to the golden age of American music had lived in near anonymity for so long. Her induction into the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 2006 had already been a step toward that recognition, but it wasn't until her passing that the full scope of her influence began to unfold. Musicians, both old and new, cited her as a blueprint for perseverance, proof that greatness isn't always loud. From Detroit to London, from New York to Tokyo, her melodies kept resurfacing, sampled, reinterpreted, reimagined. In every corner of the world where soul music still mattered, Sylvia Moy's fingerprints were there. Even beyond her music, her legacy lived through the people she touched. The children from her Center for Creative Communications, many of whom came from neighborhoods where dreams felt impossible, still spoke about her years later. "She taught me that my story mattered," one former student said. That, perhaps, was her truest song, one written not with ink, but with compassion. American culture has a way of rediscovering its forgotten heroes. With Sylvia, that rediscovery felt like a gentle awakening, as if the country had finally realized that the soundtrack of its golden era had a woman's signature hidden beneath the grooves. In documentaries, retrospectives, and YouTube tributes, her name began appearing alongside legends she once quietly stood beside. And yet, even in this late recognition, there was something poetic, almost fitting. Sylvia never sought fame in life, and perhaps that's why her rediscovery feels so sincere now. The world may have taken decades to say her name, but it's saying it with reverence. When you listen closely to those old Motown records, you can still feel her there in the rhythm, in the phrasing, in the tenderness of each note. She may have been forgotten by the industry for a time, but never by the people who loved her music. Because some voices don't fade, they simply wait to be heard again. The story of Sylvia Moy isn't one of tragedy, it's one of grace. She lived in a world that often forgot the hands behind its greatest art, and still, she kept creating. From a small house in Detroit came melodies that shaped generations, songs that reminded people how to love, how to dream, and how to believe again. She didn't chase fame, she chased truth. And the truth, as she wrote it, has never stopped singing. When you listen to My Cherie Amour or Uptight, Everything's All Right, you're not just hearing a song. You're hearing the courage of a woman who dared to speak through music when few wanted to listen. You're hearing her fingerprints on the heart of Motown, a legacy carved not in marble, but in sound. She showed the world that art made in silence can still echo louder than applause. It's been years since Sylvia Moy left us, but her story still lingers in the radio static of a late-night drive, in the warmth of a familiar lyric, in the way her melodies seem to comfort even strangers. The city she loved, Detroit, still hums with her memory. The children she mentored still carry her lessons. The artists who came after her still walk through the doors she quietly opened. Sylvia once said that music was a conversation with the soul. Maybe that's why her songs endure, because they never stop talking to us. And maybe that's why this story matters, because it reminds us that greatness isn't about being seen. It's about being heard, and felt, and remembered. As the camera fades, imagine her one last time sitting by the piano, fingers tracing the keys, smiling as the tape begins to roll. The same woman who once promised to write a hit for a young Stevie Wonder, keeping a dream alive. The same woman who taught a city that even when the spotlight moves on, the music never dies. So now, it's our turn to remember. If her songs ever meant something to you, if they played in your childhood home, or comforted you through hard times, leave a message for Sylvia Moy in the comments below. Do you think the world ever gave her the recognition she truly deserved? And if this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel and help us keep these memories alive. Because some stars never fade, they just shine where fewer eyes can see.